Hello, my bright crocheters. I'm Kate of Charm and Strange Crochet. Today we're going to talk about all the basics of how to crochet. We'll cover everything from how to hold your hook and your yarn to how to tie a slip knot, how to do the starting chain, how to make the single crochet stitch, and how to fasten off and weave in the ends once you've completed a project. Let's get started. So first off, this tutorial is for right-handed people who would hold their crochet hook in their right hand and their yarn in their left. If you are left-handed, unfortunately this video is not for you, but there are plenty of tutorial videos out there. You'll just want to search left-handed crochet tutorials, and that will get you where you need to go. So these are all the basic supplies you're going to need for any given crochet project. Obviously, crochet hook and yarn, you're not going to get anywhere without those. But some basic tools and supplies that will definitely help you along the way include scissors, because you're eventually going to have to cut your yarn. My mom gave me this pair when I was a kid, and I adore them. They're called Slip and Snip, and when they're folded up like this, I can just toss them into my bag, and I don't have to worry about getting stabbed when I'm digging for them later. Super great scissors. You will also need a yarn needle. It's a little pointed, but it's not terribly sharp. And the eye is much thicker than the eye of a regular sewing needle, so that your yarn can fit through it. A row counter is also going to be really helpful. There are a lot of row counter apps for smart devices. If that's what you prefer, I like having a physical one. And this one used to have a little loop that you could clip onto your crochet project, but that broke off a long time ago. So I just hold it next to me while I work. That is very helpful for me. And then a set of stitch markers. These, kind of like a safety pin, can lock, and these are therefore called interlocking stitch markers, or sometimes just locking stitch markers. It's a pretty flexible plastic, and those are really helpful as well. The colors are mostly just fun, but sometimes it does help to color code the stitch markers on a project. We won't be going over that today, but yeah, sometimes it can be helpful to have different colors on the same project. So getting started, let's first go over how to tie a slip knot. I only know how to tie a slip knot using a crochet hook. If you can just tie one, that is awesome, good for you, but I have to use a hook. So to tie a slip knot, you're gonna leave about 6 or so inches of a yarn tail and grab that in place with your left thumb, and with your right hand taking it, you're gonna wrap the yarn around your index and middle finger, bring it back up, and wrap it behind one more time, but this time instead of going straight down, you're going to bring the yarn over to the left so that on the back of your hand you have an X. And then hold it with your ring finger and your thumb. Now you're going to take the crochet hook, stick it through there, grab the last part of the yarn that you brought back, and pull it through, and you have a slip knot. Now if you grab the free end, the yarn tail, it'll pull really loose. If you grab the working end of your yarn, it'll pull tighter. I'll show that to you a couple more times. So with your tail, behind your 2 fingers, up in front of them, pull it to the left and grab it either with your ring finger or your pinky. Now with your hook, you're going to go under this part of the X and grab the part that was wrapped around your finger last and pull it through and pull your knot. that one more time. Couple inches of tail, up and back and grab it. Under that one, over that one, grabbing this one. Pull it and then pull it tight. Now you don't want to pull it super, super, super tight. You need there to be enough wiggle room there, so a little tighter than that, just about like that. So I'm taking the tail of my yarn and I'm holding it in my right hand just so it's out of my way. You can let it dangle free if you like, but I prefer to have it out of my way. And then holding the yarn is a really personal thing. I know when I started crocheting, I just wrapped it around my index finger a bunch of times. Some people, I think, will just kind of have it loose between their index and middle finger. But for me now, what I do is I wrap it around both my pinky and my index finger. So I put my hand flat over the yarn and turn my hand so that it's on around my pinky. Turn my hand back around and wrap it twice around my index finger. So it looks a little crazy on my hand, but I find that this is the best way for me to control my tension, which refers to how tightly I'm pulling the yarn as I work. So once again, with my hand over the yarn, I flip my hand so it's around my pinky, flip my hand back over, and get it around my index finger twice. So the next step is to do a starting chain. Since this is just a little sample project, we are going to make 9 chains so that we can have 8 single crochet stitches on our rows. So here we go. You wrap the yarn around your hook, and that's called yarning over. And then you just pull that yarn through the loop on your hook. There's a couple different ways you can wrap the yarn. Some people kind of use their left hand more like that. Some people will just use their fingers to twist or roll the hook between their fingers like that. I use it's all on my right wrist. I spin my whole wrist to get the yarn wrapped around the hook. So just play with it. Nothing's going to feel comfortable at first, but play with it a couple different ways. Give it a couple tries and find what is most comfortable for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting while I'm talking is not my strong suit, so you'll probably catch me counting a couple times. So here we now have 9 starting chains. And you can see each chain looks kind of like a little V. These 2 loops here and here are one chain. So this is going to be referred to as the first chain from your hook, which you are just about always going to skip. And that's because you need the height for the crochet stitch, otherwise it just won't really work. So flipping this sideways, we're going to start doing the single crochet stitch now. So our hook goes into the second chain from the hook. That's the first. This is the second. So get the hook in there, yarn over, and bring that yarn up through the loop, which is called pulling up a loop. Now we have 2 loops on our hook, and we yarn over again, and pull it through both loops. And that's your first single crochet stitch. It looks a little crooked. The first stitch in a row always looks crooked, at least for me. I'm sure some people out there can do a better and straighter job. But the great thing is that as you keep crocheting, as you keep making more rows, this first stitch will kind of straighten out and it'll look a lot better. So one thing that can be tricky when you're first learning is finding the next chain. This here looks like a nice big hole for me to put my chain, but if we look really closely, we can see that that's actually where I just did my last stitch. That's why it's so big. So you're going to, instead of going through there, you want to go to the next chain. And a yarn like this one does make it easier to see because it changes color so frequently. I can say, oh yeah, I just made one stitch into the kind of transition between the green and the white. So now I'm going into the green chain. Pull up your loop, yarn over, pull it through both loops, and get that piece of hair out of the way. In my house, I almost always have my own hair, my husband's hair, see it's still there, or cat hair on my crochet projects. That's just a fact of life. Here's number 7. And there's number 8. So I'm sure you've noticed that we just worked from right to left, which to anyone from the West feels really weird, I know, but that is the nature of right-handed crochet. In left-handed crochet, you do work from left to right, but basically everything I'm doing would be mirrored. So because we have to work from the right to the left, in order to get our second row, we now have to flip the project around. So to do that, we're going to chain 1, because that's the height for a single crochet stitch. We've made 1 chain, and now we're going to flip it around in our hand like that. And now we're working into the top of the stitch from the first row. So we can see here we have these 2 little, like a capital A, and we have a horizontal line. This is the space that we're going to work through. If we flip it up to the top 2 loops of the chain, or of the stitch, I'm sorry, the top 2 loops of the stitch are going to be on our hook. So we've already chained 1, and now we insert our hook into the top of that first stitch. Same thing as on the first row. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull it through both loops. Whoops. That happens to me a lot. I do tend to drop the yarn, or sometimes I'll try to grab it and it doesn't come through, so I have to yarn over like 3 times in order to complete the stitch. It particularly happens when I'm trying to record myself. Okay, so here now we're working into what was the very first stitch we made, and it's a little bit harder because it's kind of sideways, or not sideways, but it's a little bit harder to work into. So it can help if we flip it so the top is facing us. And sometimes you might need to just get one of those top loops at a time onto your hook, and that is totally okay. So now that we have completed 2 rows, we need to turn it again. So again, chain 1, and turn it. Now some people prefer to turn the project and then chain one. It really doesn't matter. It's completely up to you how you want to do it. Sometimes I find that my grip is a little bit too tight, so I'll, like you just saw me do, I'll drop the yarn from my pointer finger so it's only wrapped around it once. There's number 7. And again, this one's a little bit tricky to work into. You just kind of have to force it. Now I've done 3 rows. Now single crochet rows are sometimes a little bit harder to count, but if you look closely, you can see we have these V's. Those are the posts of our first row. This is almost like a capital A. That's our second row. And then capital V's again. That is our third row. So if I was counting my rows for a project, but I forgot to use my row counter for a little while, I would just know, I would just be able to go 1, 2, 3 rows, yeah. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do a total of 7 rows, and once I finish that, we'll meet you back and we'll talk about how to fasten off the project and weave in the ends. Okay, so now I have 7 rows. You can see it's almost a square, not a perfect square, but I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stitches. So now that I have completed my little practice square, I need to fasten it off and weave in the ends. And what fasten off means is it just means tie a final knot, because if I were to leave this, this can just pull out my last couple of stitches. And obviously we don't want that. Now, what's great about these stitch markers is if I needed to walk away from this for a while, we'll put a stitch marker on it and lock the stitch marker, and then no matter what happens, that last stitch I made is not going anywhere. I'm pulling pretty hard, and that last stitch is going to be protected. So if you're sticking your project in a bag and you're going to travel with it before you're able to crochet again, you definitely want to have a stitch marker on that. So redoing my last 2 stitches, and now I've finished. So to fasten off, I'm simply going to chain 1, set my hook down, and grab my scissors, and leaving a tail of about maybe 6-7 inches. Gonna cut. And now I can just pull the end of the yarn out through that chain that I made. And if I pull the chain really, really tight, this isn't going to unravel. So technically, you could just cut the yarn really, really close right at these 2 ends, but it's much more secure for your project, especially if it's something like a dishcloth that's going to get a lot of, you know, the scrubbing action, and then you throw it in the washing machine, it gets tossed around a lot. Just having your starting and finishing knots is a little bit, leaves it a little bit vulnerable. So we need to do what's called weaving in the ends. So you're going to take your tail, thread the needle. What I do is I pinch it and I just kind of wiggle the eye of the needle down over the yarn. And that's a really easy way of threading the needle. You don't have to worry about the end fraying apart or anything like that. So now we're gonna weave the end of this yarn through the posts of the stitch. And I prefer to do it on what is considered the wrong side of the stitch. So the side that has the capital A in the post, that's the wrong side. This side where the stitch looks like a capital V is much smoother and prettier. That's considered the right side of the stitch. So we're going to flip the project over so that the wrong side is facing us. And we are going to stick our needle behind the posts of each of these stitches. See, if I flip it over, you can't see the needle through the stitch. Now, a good rule of thumb for weaving in your ends is either maybe 8 to 10 stitches or 2 inches. This project isn't big enough for either of those. And that's okay too. If you are working on a really narrow project and you don't have 8 to 10 stitches to weave the end and through, or you don't have 2 inches to weave your end through, that's okay. Now you want to pull it all the way through, but don't pull it completely tight. If you pull it really tight, you'll see you've shrunken your edge there. But if that happens, just give it a tug and it'll straighten right back out. So now we need to tie a knot around this stitch, the last stitch that we wove behind. And because I do everything right to left, I now flip it upside down, just so I'm still working right to left. I'm gonna thread my needle not behind this first stitch, but behind the second post of this first stitch, right in there. Pull it through so that I have a loop, stick my needle through that loop, and pull it nice and tight. So now I have a knot around that last white stitch. And I'm kind of paranoid. I like to tie 2 knots. And when I tie a second knot, I stick my needle behind that same post and then behind the next one. And again, leave a loop and pull it through the loop and pull it tight. Now I've got a nice secure knot. It's not going to go anywhere. And even if these 2 knots were to come through, you still have one more knot over here. So this project is probably not going to come undone. That's pretty secure. So now I can take my scissors and cut the yarn very, very close to that knot. Okay, and now we just need to do the same thing with our starting tail. So again, folding that down and taking the eye of the needle, pulling that through. Of course, you can do it what I consider to be the more traditional way, which is just sticking the end of the yarn through. But see, my yarn is kind of separating. That to me was a lot harder and slower than this method of folding it and wiggling the eye of the needle over that fold. Now again, I want to weave this right to left, so I flip it backwards onto the wrong side, and I could just weave it up and down around here. This is my starting chain, but I would rather weave it through the stitches here. So that's what I'm going to do. So one disadvantage to a yarn that changes color this quickly is that now I'm tying a green knot around a white stitch. And that's Obviously it's not the end of the world. It's still going to look okay. Here again, we don't want to pull this too tight because our stitch is kind of collapsing. So I'm just going to tug that a little bit back up so it's nice and flat. And now I'm going to tie my green knot around my white stitch, which, as I was saying, is not the end of the world. It doesn't necessarily look bad, but it is a little more obvious. For something like a coaster, it's always going to be flat on your table. So you can just make sure to have the side with the knots down and have the prettier side facing up. For something like a dishcloth, whoops, I forgot to tie my knot because I was talking. For something like a dishcloth or a scarf, it doesn't really have a right side or a wrong side. So the aesthetics of the knots showing, if you don't want the knots to be so visible, you would just have to buy a yarn that is doesn't change color as frequently, so that your tail is going to be the same color as your first several stitches. Or a more traditional yarn that's all one color, it's not going to change at all. Now sometimes I get a little extra paranoid and I want to weave it back through to the first side once again. So I'm going to do that this time just to show you what I mean. I've already tied 2 knots here on this end, but I'm just going to go tie one more knot. So I'm going to weave this back through to the beginning. And pull it. Again, not pulling too tight so that I don't ruin the shape of my square. And now I don't have a whole lot of tail to work with, so I might not be able to tie another knot. Just barely enough. My loop is tiny, but I got it through. So now I have 4 knots. There's my starting slip knot, 2 knots here, and a 4th knot right here. So yeah, this bad boy could get flung around and scrubbed with and all kinds of stuff, and it probably is, and it is not going to come unraveled. So there you go. We now have a little, you could call this a sample swatch of the yarn. We covered how to make a starting chain, how to make our first row, how to chain and turn and make our second row. We covered how to fasten off at this end, how to weave in the ends, and so now we have a perfect little sample square. If this tutorial helped you, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. In the future, I will have more tutorials, including how to do taller crochet stitches and how to crochet in the round and all kinds of other tips and tricks for crocheting. Thanks for watching. If this video helped you to learn a new technique, please drop a like and let me know in the comments what's on your hook. Happy crocheting!